Sometimes the loudest legacies are carried in silence. He didn't ask for attention. He didn't fight back with fists or words. All Ben Carter did was wear his father's army jacket, 2 sizes too big, threadbare with time, and stitched with the kind of love no one else could see. In a school where last names defined your worth, Ben's silence made him a target, mocked, shoved, humiliated. Not because he wanted to stand out, but because he refused to let go of the only thing left of his father. They thought it was just a jacket, but that worn green fabric held memories of sacrifice, echoes of war, and the unspoken courage of a soldier who never came home. And when the world tried to strip it from his shoulders, what followed wasn't just justice, it was a reckoning. A colonel arrived, stories buried in dust were brought to light, and in that quiet Kentucky town, a boy reminded everyone what honor truly looks like. Because sometimes being brave doesn't mean speaking up. It means holding on, even when no one else understands why. Ben's day had barely begun when the cruel voices of Hunter and Blake sliced through the chill of the school hallway like knives. "Why do you still wear that filthy old jacket?" Hunter sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. "Your dad wasn't anybody, just some grunt who got himself killed," Blake added with a cruel smirk, tugging hard at the sleeve like it was trash he had the right to toss away. Their laughter followed, sharp, shallow, the kind that tries to mask weakness with volume. Their fingers clawed at the jacket, trying to tear it off him, as if shredding it would somehow erase the only part of his father Ben still had left. Later, in the principal's office, the three bullies sat smug, untouched, acting like the whole thing was a joke. Ben sat opposite them, completely still, silent. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him crack. He wouldn't apologize. He wouldn't flinch. Outside, the sudden crunch of gravel broke the stale air. 2 black SUVs pulled up and came to a heavy, deliberate stop in front of the school. Then the doors opened. When the colonel stepped inside, he didn't have to say a word. He didn't need to. His presence filled the room with something heavier than scolding or punishment, something called respect. Because sometimes true honor doesn't ask for attention. It doesn't announce itself. It walks in quietly and demands to be felt. 15-year-old Ben Carter didn't own much, but every single morning before school, he made sure to wear the one thing that mattered more than anything, his father's old army jacket. It was a faded shade of olive green, too big for his lean frame, 2 sizes too big, in fact, and it sagged slightly on his shoulders, heavy with stitched-in memories and silent stories. The left pocket was torn just a bit at the seam. The collar still held the faint scent of pipe tobacco and pine needles, something earthy and familiar. That jacket once belonged to Staff Sergeant Harold Carter, a man Ben could barely remember, only fragments and flashes, but whose presence lingered in their home like a quiet echo that never left. Harold had been killed in action when Ben was only 3. There were no grand tributes, no medals gleaming in a case, no ceremonial fanfare, just a folded flag, a grainy black and white photograph, a cheap frame, and that jacket. His mother couldn't bear the weight of that loss. Eventually, she left. So it was his grandfather, Walter Carter, a stone-faced Korean War veteran with hands like weathered leather and a voice like carved oak, who raised him in an old creaky farmhouse on the edge of a sleepy Kentucky town. It was the kind of place where people still tipped their hats to the pastor at the grocery store, where tractors outnumbered sedans in the high school parking lot, where family names carried history and memory flowed deeper than the rivers, and that was the root of Ben's struggle. At Maple Hill High, Ben wasn't the son of a star quarterback or a senator's nephew. He wasn't someone people recognized. He was the quiet kid in the oversized military jacket who kept to himself. He never joined the cafeteria jokes. He didn't wear flashy sneakers. He didn't scroll through TikTok or post videos for likes. Instead, he carried an old brown leather wallet, worn at the corners, smooth from use, and inside, tucked behind his student ID, was a photo of his father. Every now and then, if you look at it closely, you might catch Ben brushing his thumb over the edge of that photo with a quiet reverence, like he was afraid the image might fade if he let it go too long. Most kids didn't understand the jacket. But Ben did. To him, it was armor. It was truth. It was a symbol. A silent way of telling the world, my father stood for something. And I won't let anyone forget it. Not now. Not ever. Hunter Wills, on the other hand, walked the halls of Maple Hill High like he owned the place. And in a way, he did. His father, Mayor Glenn Wills, had his name etched on a brass plaque in the school's front lobby. Donor of the new scoreboard, sponsor of the robotics lab, the man in every ribbon-cutting photo with that politician's smile. Hunter wore that privilege like a second skin, smooth, invisible, and smug. Blake Tisdale and Sean McCaffrey were always at his side. Blake, broad-shouldered and bullish, led with his elbows and followed with a smirk. Sean, smaller and quieter, always hovered a step behind, but his laugh, sharp and automatic, was ready whenever Hunter threw out a cruel joke. And Ben Carter, in his silent armor, may as well have worn a target on his back. One Thursday afternoon in the noisy cafeteria filled with slamming trays and scraping forks, Hunter's voice pierced through it all like a cold wind. "Hey, Army surplus," he called across the room. "You lose a bet, or is that just the only coat you own?" Ben said nothing. He never did. He sat quietly at the far end of the table near the vending machines, head down, hand gently resting on the shoulder seam of the jacket, right where the patch had long since frayed. Blake leaned over, balancing his tray. Bet his old man was a nobody. Probably just cleaned toilets or something. Sean snorted. Probably got himself killed before anyone knew he existed. Ben's jaw tightened, but he still didn't respond. That silence, though, that refusal to play their game, only made them angrier. Hunter reached out, slow and smug, and tugged at the jacket sleeve. "Let's see what's under that rag, hero boy." Ben pulled back, but Blake was already reaching from the other side, grabbing at the collar. For a moment, the jacket stretched tight between them, like a flag caught in the middle of a silent war. Ben's eyes sparked with something old, fierce, and full of unspoken fire. Across the room, Mrs. Nancy Palpaw froze mid-step. Years ago, she'd stitched battlefield wounds under the blood-red haze of Kandahar. Now she watched high schoolers in sweatshirts and sneakers. She saw what was happening, saw the boy being pulled in two directions like rope in a tug-of-war. And in the back of her mind, something screamed at her to move, to act. But for that fleeting second, she didn't. Maybe it was the familiarity. Maybe it was something else. The violence didn't start with fists or shouts. It crept in quietly beneath the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, slowly pooling like a leak no one noticed until the damage was done. Maybe it was because she had seen too many kids like Ben, kids who stood alone while the rest looked away. Maybe a part of her still believed he had the strength to make it through, to walk away from all of it with his head high. Ben yanked the jacket from the tray with a grunt, his jaw clenched tight. Without a word, he turned his back on them, the untouched lunch beside him like a silent witness. Hunter burst into laughter, sharp and cruel. Blake thumped him on the back, grinning like they had just scored the game-winning touchdown. Sean smiled too, but his grin faltered at the edges, something uncertain flickering in his eyes. Behind the glass of the teacher's lounge, Mrs. Powell watched, her gaze heavy and full of knowing. Her voice barely audible, she whispered to herself, "That boy carries more than any of them will ever understand." And the worst part, the part that twisted in her chest, they weren't finished with him. Not yet. To the rest of Maple Hill High, it was just a jacket. Old, tattered, sun-faded, something that should have been buried in a thrift store pile or forgotten in an attic box. Not something to wear daily like a medal. But to Ben Carter, that jacket was sacred. It was more than fabric. It was armor, identity, memory. A second skin that had once shielded his father through monsoon rains, mortar fire, jungle trails, and ghost-quiet nights in combat halfway around the world. There were no gleaming metals sewn onto it, no ribbons, no name tags, just faded seams, fraying edges, and faint stains that told stories Ben had never been told, but somehow always understood. He'd sit on the back porch, knees tucked close, his grandfather softly snoring in the old rocking chair beside him, and run his fingers over those seams. He imagined where his father had stood, wrapped in that jacket, maybe on a muddy hillside in Laos, rain dripping off his helmet, waiting for orders that never came. Maybe kneeling beside a fallen comrade, pressing the jacket into a wound to stop the bleeding. Or maybe sitting beneath a jungle tree, penning the letter Ben now carried everywhere. Still sealed, tucked inside his wallet, like a heartbeat he didn't have to read to feel. The scent of the jacket never faded. Tobacco, sweat, and pine. Earthy, stubborn, familiar. It clung to the fabric like memory, like truth that refused to be washed out. It was the only thing the army had returned of his father, besides a folded flag and a brief letter. His mother had buried her grief and never spoke of it again, but Ben had never let go. That jacket stayed with him through every growth spurt, through every silent lunch, through every sideways glance and cruel whisper. He didn't wear it to pretend, he wore it to remember. To hold on, in a town where boys were measured by touchdowns scored, trucks owned, and family names whispered like royalty, Ben's jacket was his quiet rebellion. His way of saying, I come from something real, something earned, something you don't get to laugh away. They could mock him, they could shove him, but as long as he wore that jacket, his father walked with him, and that was worth more than 1,000 ribbons. It happened on a Friday afternoon, just minutes before the final bell. The air had that bite, that dry, metallic warning that winter was on its way. Kids flooded out of classrooms, buzzing with weekend plans, some headed to football practice, others to the gas station where they'd lean on cars and sip cheap sodas until dusk. No one noticed the quiet patch of grass behind the school, by the old flagpole. No one but Ben Carter and the three boys waiting for him. He took the same path home every day, down the cracked pavement, past the gym slope, along the trail leading to his grandfather's farm. It was usually quiet, tucked away from laughter and judgment. Safe, or so he thought. Hey, Carter, Hunter's voice called out from behind the maintenance shed. Blake and Sean appeared on either side, moving like shadows that had been waiting. Ben paused for the briefest second, then kept walking. But Hunter wasn't there to talk. You think you're better than the rest of us, 'cause you wear that thing every damn day? Hunter asked, voice low and cold. Ben stopped, not out of fear, but exhaustion. It's just a jacket, he replied. Blake chuckled darkly. If it's just a jacket, then give it up. Ben looked down at the patch on the sleeve, the worn insignia that had once meant something. He held the fabric like it might vanish. Hunter stepped closer, breath sharp. Your dad wasn't a hero. He was nobody. You hear me? A nobody who got himself killed. Then it happened, fast and mean. Blake shoved Ben hard. He stumbled but stayed on his feet, tightening his grip on the jacket. Sean shifted back, hesitant, unsure, but Hunter didn't pause. He lunged, grabbing the collar and yanking hard. Threads strained and groaned. Ben twisted, fists clenched, ready, but he didn't throw a punch. He shouted instead, raw and defiant, "It's mine!" Not anymore, Hunter growled. They dragged him down. The damp ground soaked his jeans. Cold mud splashed his back. Gravel tore into his knuckles as he struggled to hold on. But it was 3 against 1. Blake leaned down, sneering, eyes cruel. Say it. Say your dad was nothing. Ben's lips parted, blood salty on his tongue. He wasn't afraid. He was furious. No, he whispered, broken but unbending. I won't. And still, he clung to that jacket like it was life itself. Across the field, through a classroom window, Mrs. Nancy Powell stood watching. And this time, she didn't just watch. She turned from the glass and walked with purpose toward the basement file room. Jaw clenched and heart pounding, she knew the truth was buried down there somewhere, hidden in the dark and dust. If Ben Carter could take punches in mud for his father's name, then the very least she could do was remind the world why that name still held weight. And at that very instant, the tide began to shift. Nancy Powell hadn't walked into the school's record basement in more years than she could count. It reeked of stale air, mold, and things long forgotten. Faded report cards, cracked plastic science trophies, yellowing football programs stacked in dented filing cabinets. Most teachers didn't even know the light switch still worked anymore. But she did. She flipped it, and the old fluorescent bulb sputtered to life, throwing long, shaky shadows across the cluttered room. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from something deeper. Purpose, resolve, Chana. She had watched the whole thing unfold from her second-floor classroom window. She saw Ben Carter pushed into the mud, fists flying, his jacket twisted in the hands of boys who didn't know the first thing about sacrifice or service. And it unlocked something in her, something buried under years of routine and silence. Nancy Powell had once been an Army nurse, stationed at Camp Victory during the most brutal stretch of the Iraq Surge. She remembered nights thick with blood and smoke, the air filled with the cries of young soldiers too torn up to even scream. She had witnessed courage, real courage, not in those who shouted loudest, but in the ones who simply endured, quietly, steadily, just like Ben. He reminded her of those boys. She pulled open a rusted drawer labeled by CD and began to sift. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, maybe a record of service, maybe an old article or award no one thought to toss, just something, anything, a scrap of proof that Harold Carter was more than a whisper from the past. For 20 minutes, she combed through files layered in dust and pages curled with time. Her fingers were gray with it, and then, tucked between a 1995 yearbook and a long-forgotten PTA budget report, she found it, a single manila folder marked, Carter Harold, Staff Sergeant. She lifted it carefully as if it might turn to ash in her hands. Inside, a typewritten summary stamped confidential, partially blacked out with age and ink. But one line stood clear, cutting through the years. Commended for exceptional valor in the unauthorized rescue of 6 fellow servicemen during a covert operation outside Quang Tri Province, Vietnam. No formal medal issued due to classified status. Nancy exhaled, her eyes suddenly wet. They had called him a nobody, said he was just a janitor, a has-been, a man whose name didn't matter. But this file, this forgotten folder in a forgotten basement, said otherwise. Staff Sergeant Harold Carter had saved lives, and no one knew, not until now. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she hadn't dialed in over a decade. George Adams, Rhett. They had served at different times, in different wars, but they lived by the same code. She knew he hadn't changed. Still sharp, still respected, still a soldier. He picked up after 2 rings. Nancy, he said, his voice a mix of curiosity and warmth. It's been a while. I need your help, she said. Her voice didn't shake. There's a boy, and a jacket, and a name that deserves to be remembered. She emailed him the file before the hour was out. That night she couldn't sleep, not from guilt or regret, but anticipation. Because for the first time in years, she didn't feel like just a teacher anymore. She felt like a soldier again. And tomorrow, she wouldn't be the only one standing with Ben Carter. By morning, Maple Hill High buzzed with an energy no one could name. Whispers passed like wind through the hallways. Restless glances bounced from locker to locker. Something was coming. They couldn't say what exactly, but they felt it. The air had changed. Ben Carter stepped through the front doors wearing the same jacket, his father's, still muddy, still stained from yesterday's fight. His backpack slumped low on one shoulder, worn thin, but his spine was straight and his jaw set. He walked like someone who'd already made peace with the worst of it, who wasn't afraid anymore. Most kids didn't look at him, but a few did, and the ones who did looked longer than usual. Their conversations stopped half a beat late. Their laughter faded too quickly. And Hunter Wills, Ben's attacker, was already sitting in Principal Donnelly's office. Flanked by Blake and Sean, the smugness on his face traded for something quieter, something shaken. Principal Donnelly sat behind his desk, frowning. The mayor's son had dragged the school into something far bigger than detention or suspension. And while the Carter name wasn't one that commanded city halls or headlines, rumors had begun to stir like smoke. It was just after second period when the noise came. A low, steady hum, tires on gravel. Every student near the front windows turned. Teachers glanced outside, shielding their eyes from the late autumn sun. 2 black SUVs rolled into the school's circular driveway. No sirens, no rush, just purpose. Quiet, calm arrival. The first vehicle came to a stop, sunlight catching its matte finish. The license plate read, U.S. Army Retired. A gold decal clung to the windshield, 82nd Airborne Division. Doors opened. From the lead SUV stepped a tall man in his late 60s, dressed in full Army service uniform. His jacket was pristine. The ribbons across his chest shimmered, worn not for show, but because he'd earned them. Every one. He stood tall, not stiff, not theatrical, but solid, grounded. A man who didn't demand respect because he already carried it. Colonel George Adams had arrived. From the second SUV, a younger man emerged, navy dress blues, probably former enlisted, now working in some official capacity with a veterans organization. He held a leather folder close to his side. The students watched, frozen behind the glass, and the world shifted again. Ben moved slowly, deliberately toward the school's main entrance. The hallway seemed to pause with him, the air itself turning still as if it, too, was waiting. By the time they reached the front doors, the buzz of the office had already disappeared into silence. Outside the principal's office, Ben sat alone, his fingers lightly clutching the hem of his father's old military jacket. His eyes were fixed on the floor, distant, until the double doors swung open. And for the first time that week, someone walked in for him. Not with nervous explanations or empty apologies, but with dignity, authority, and a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Principal Donnelly stood so abruptly that his coffee mug nearly toppled off the edge of his desk. Across from him, Hunter Wills and his friends lounged in the usual office chairs, wearing smirks passed down from powerful family names etched into local street signs and city monuments. But the second Colonel George Adams entered, the mood in the room changed. Gravity seemed to settle in the air. Silence pressed down like reverence. Colonel Adams didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence, his uniform, and the quiet strength he carried did all the talking. The medals and ribbons on his chest caught the cold fluorescent lights and shimmered with quiet defiance, earned, not given. He nodded once at Donnelly, then faced the room with calm resolve. Ben Carter sat motionless. His father's jacket now rested in his lap, his eyes wide, breath caught somewhere in his throat. When Colonel Adams's gaze landed gently on him, it was like a light switching on in the dark. "You must be Ben," he said softly. Ben gave a small nod, still unable to speak. The colonel turned to Principal Donnelly. "I understand this young man was being asked to apologize for wearing his father's service jacket." Donnelly cleared his throat nervously. "Well, Colonel, it's not quite that simple. There was a disruption yesterday." Adams raised his hand, calm but unmistakably firm. "Let me make it simple." He took a step forward, opening the worn leather folder handed to him by the younger officer at his side. Inside, protected with great care, was a yellowed letter. He held it up, almost reverently. "This," he said, "was written by Staff Sergeant Harold Carter, your father, during his last deployment in Vietnam, in case he didn't make it home." He turned to Ben and gently placed the letter into his hands. Ben unfolded it with care, his eyes skimming the page. For a moment, everything around him faded. Walls, people, voices. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. But his shoulders drew back, his chin lifted, and something deep within him shifted. It wasn't just pride. It was something older, stronger, something inherited. Colonel Adams turned to face the rest of the room. "Harold Carter didn't die a nobody," he said evenly. "He died pulling 6 men out of enemy fire during a mission this country never had the decency to acknowledge publicly. He didn't get a medal. He didn't get a parade. He got silence. And that silence is what his son has been carrying every day since." Hunter Wills, once so self-assured, squirmed in his seat. Blake looked down at the carpet. Sean's face turned pale and distant. "This jacket," Adams continued, nodding toward Ben's lap, "isn't a costume. It isn't for show. It's a legacy. And no student, no school, has the authority to take that away from him." Donnelly parted his lips to reply, but Adams cut him off, not with volume, but with a quiet command that carried more power than any shout. "This boy will not apologize. Not today. Not ever." Then turning back to Ben, he lowered his voice, now thick with emotion. "Your father would have been proud of you, and so am I." Ben finally looked up. A single tear slipped down his cheek, and he nodded, not out of obligation, but because he knew it was true. The silence that followed lingered, heavy and undeniable. No one dared to break it. Hunter Wills, once the loudest in the room, now stared at his shoes, the weight of legacy and truth crushing his smirk. Blake fidgeted with his hoodie sleeve, lips tight. Sean looked like he wished he could vanish. Principal Donnelly finally cleared his throat, though his voice had shrunk to something uncertain. I, I think we can conclude this meeting. Colonel Adams nodded, not in permission, but in finality. Ben rose slowly, folding his father's jacket with deliberate care. He tucked the letter safely inside, then turned toward the door. He didn't spare a glance at the boys who had pushed him in the mud, or at the man who almost made him apologize for honoring his father. He just walked forward, taller than he'd ever stood. Out in the hallway, a hush fell over the students gathered near the office. Word had traveled fast. 2 black SUVs, a colonel in full-dress uniform, and a boy who didn't back down. Some stepped aside, making way. Others just watched, unsure what to say. A few nodded, a silent sign of respect. For the first time, they saw him not just as a classmate, but as the son of a soldier. Ben didn't need their words. He wasn't walking for them. He was walking for his father. Behind him, Colonel Adams and the younger officer followed in quiet formation, not just escorting a student, but something greater, a legacy honored. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Powell stood at her classroom window, watching Ben cross the courtyard. She saw the way he moved now, how the jacket lifted slightly with each step, full of memory and meaning. She wiped a tear from her cheek, this time not bothering to hide it. The unexpected happened. A folded note appeared on Ben's desk during English class, left behind by someone on the football team. It wasn't signed, just a single powerful sentence. We didn't know, but we know now. In the cafeteria, something had shifted. No one took Ben's usual spot. The chair sat empty, deliberately so. That night, the story spread faster than any gossip ever could, carried from home to home like wildfire. It wasn't just about a quiet boy in a ragged jacket anymore. It became about a man, Harold Carter, whose name had once been forgotten but was now spoken with newfound reverence. A colonel with medals, a soldier with dignity. And in a small house on the outskirts of town, Ben sat in silence on the back porch, the familiar jacket wrapped around his shoulders. Next to him, his grandfather, Walter Carter, lit a pipe, the soft glow flickering against the shadows of the porch light. He exhaled slowly, placed his weathered hand gently on Ben's knee, and said in a voice thick with memory, "He'd have been proud, boy. You did right by his name." Ben didn't reply. He only nodded, his eyes fixed on the night sky where memory met meaning in a silence deeper than words. By the time Monday came, something in the halls of Maple Hill High felt irrevocably changed. No announcements were made, no emails were sent out, no special assemblies were held to explain why the mayor's son no longer strutted down the hall with his usual smug confidence. But the students knew. The teachers knew. Everyone knew. The story had taken root in hushed voices at lunch tables and quiet exchanges over textbooks. Ben Carter, the boy in the old military jacket, wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just the quiet kid who sat in the back. He was the son of Staff Sergeant Harold Carter. He was the one who stood tall when most would have folded. When Ben walked through the school doors that morning, there were no more snickers. Eyes still followed him, but not with mockery. There was something else in them now, something closer to respect. Some of the older students gave him a small nod as he passed. Younger ones stepped aside without needing to be asked. Even Hunter Wills, once brash and cruel, kept his head low and his mouth shut. Mrs. Powell met Ben at her classroom door. She didn't say much. Before the bell rang, she quietly placed a small envelope on his desk. Inside was an old photograph. His father, standing outside a field hospital tent, arms crossed, with a faint smile. On the back, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "He saved lives without needing credit. And now, so have you." Ben didn't need to respond. He slid the photo into his wallet, placing it right behind the letter. At lunch, something quietly profound occurred. Sean, once just another follower in the crowd, approached Ben's table with a tray in hand. "Can I sit here?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Ben paused for a moment, then gave a quiet nod. They ate without talking. They didn't need to. The gesture alone said everything. Later that week, Coach Ramirez pulled Ben aside and asked if he'd be willing to lead the Pledge of Allegiance before the upcoming homecoming game. The school wanted to honor his father's service. Ben agreed, but only on one condition. No speeches, no spotlight, just the flag and the jacket. That Friday night, under the lights of the packed stadium, Ben walked onto the field. His jacket was zipped, his hand placed firmly over his heart. The crowd hushed. It wasn't just patriotism that filled the air. It was something deeper. It was respect, quietly earned and profoundly deserved. Ben Carter didn't have to speak loudly anymore to be heard. All he had to do was stand tall. And finally, at last, the world around him had begun to rise with him. 2 weeks later, as the chill of November set in, Maple Hill High held a small Veterans Day gathering behind the school near the flagpole. There were no flashy banners, no cameras, no speeches rehearsed for applause, just folding chairs, a modest group of students, the clear note of a brass trumpet playing the anthem, and a row of aging veterans in worn dress blues standing quietly, dignified. Ben stood among them wearing his father's jacket. Mrs. Powell had asked him to speak, not as a student, but as a son. The night before, Ben had once again sat on the back porch with his grandfather, jacket zippo tight, letter in hand. They didn't exchange many words. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence says everything between generations. That morning, standing beneath a sky brushed by cold wind, Ben stepped up to the microphone. The flag overhead rippled gently. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice held steady. "My father never had a statue," Ben began. "He never made the front page. He didn't come home with honors or applause. He came home in a box, with a folded flag on top." He paused, letting the quiet of the morning and the wind say what he didn't. For a long time, I thought that meant his story didn't matter, that he didn't leave a mark, but I was wrong. He looked out into the small crowd, classmates with solemn faces, veterans whose eyes held a lifetime of pride and loss. "This jacket isn't just fabric. It's not for show. It's proof. Proof that someone stood for something, that someone gave everything for a country that sometimes forgets its quiet heroes." His voice lowered, but his words carried with unwavering strength. Honor isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. Sometimes it's just a boy refusing to take off his father's jacket, even when the world tells him to. Then he stepped back. No fanfare, no performance. Just truth, unvarnished and strong. The applause didn't explode. It grew, steady and sure. It began with the veterans, then the students, then the teachers who had watched this quiet boy slowly become someone they now truly saw. Later that day, Ben walked through the halls of Maple Hill with a quiet confidence. The jacket wasn't something he hid behind anymore. It was a symbol, and now, finally, everyone understood what it meant. Ben Carter never set out to become a symbol, but in a world so quick to forget, he quietly became one. Not of sorrow, but of resilience and quiet dignity. That old jacket he wore, weathered and worn, spoke louder than any speech ever could. He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to justify. He just kept showing up, day after day, carrying a piece of someone he loved. From the doorway of her classroom, Mrs. Powell stood watching, her eyes glistening, her heart swelling with something that hurt and healed at the same time. Years ago, she'd stitched wounds and comforted the dying in combat zones thousands of miles away. Back then, the battlefield was filled with bullets and dust. Now, she was in a different kind of war. One fought in silence, in whispers, in the cruel glances of those who didn't understand. And in this war, she had seen something just as brave. A boy refusing to let go. Ben never posted about it. He never defended himself or tried to explain why that jacket mattered. He never once asked for sympathy, and he didn't chase admiration. He simply wore it because it meant something. It was something. And by doing so, he gave people a reason to remember. In a time when value is measured in likes, awards, and who shouts the loudest, Ben's quiet act reminds us that true honor doesn't beg for attention. It earns it, gently, steadily, one step at a time. The truest kind of courage doesn't always look like heroism. Sometimes it's just someone refusing to let go of a memory, holding on to what matters when no one else can see why. His story is more than a moment. It's a question to all of us. What are we choosing to carry? What pieces of the past are we keeping alive? Not in dusty exhibits or faded photographs, but in our choices, in our daily lives, in our hearts. Maybe it's a folded up letter tucked away in a drawer, a worn out flannel shirt with paint stains, a lullaby hummed softly in the kitchen, things so small they almost disappear, until we realize they're everything. We invite you to pause and think, do you have something like Ben's jacket? Something that others may not understand, but you've held on to because it carries someone you loved? Tell us, share your story in the comments. No matter how small it feels, your memory might light a spark in someone else's heart. It might remind them they're not alone. And if this story touched you, let us know. Give it a like, subscribe, and send it to someone who understands the quiet kind of strength, the kind that doesn't shout but still echoes. Because stories like Ben's aren't told for applause. They're told because they matter, because they mean something. Some legacies hang on walls and frames gleaming with medals, but the ones that matter most live in how we carry ourselves, how we remember, and how we choose to keep someone's spirit alive. Not in grand gestures, but in small, everyday acts of love.